When the story begins, the large research station floating in deep space is quiet, almost peaceful, but that peace is built on the backs of people who work far more than they should. Among them is a human engineer who has always been patient, calm, and willing to help. Most species on the station admire humans for these qualities. Some, however, mistake patience for weakness. And on this particular station, a few alien supervisors have begun to push the engineer more and more every day. The engineer never complained. Not once. Every time someone asked for help, the engineer showed up. When a system broke, the engineer fixed it. When a group of new workers needed training, the engineer stayed late to teach them. When a dangerous malfunction threatened the water recycling unit, the engineer worked through the night without sleep. Anyone watching would say the human was reliable, dedicated, and easy to work with. But the people giving orders did not see dedication. They only saw a worker who never said no. The station's daily announcements echoed through the long metal corridors. The lights hummed softly, and the air smelled faintly of coolant. The engineer walked to work like always, wearing a tired smile, even though the last full night of sleep had been 2 weeks ago. Humans are tough, but even toughness has a limit. Not that anyone had noticed. The alien supervisors were tall, with sharp eyes and voices that clicked when they spoke. They valued efficiency above everything. To them, humans were useful because they could handle pressure quietly. They believed silence meant weakness, not endurance. Whenever the engineer finished one task, 3 more were added. Whenever someone else made a mistake, the human had to fix it. Whenever a system needed upgrading, the human was told to do it. Alone, other species on the station saw the unfairness. A few whispered about it in the halls. Some felt guilty. A group of younger workers even tried to help once, but the supervisors scolded them and said, "Humans handle this better." The engineer heard that sentence many times. Every time it stung a little more. On this day, the engineer was repairing a malfunctioning power relay network. It was dangerous work, but necessary. If the engineer stepped away for even a moment, half the station would lose power. Sweat mixed with dust on the human's forehead. The tools felt heavier than usual. The constant vibration of the station's engines pulsed through the floor and into tired legs. Still, the work continued. Hours passed, then more hours. Then someone shouted from across the room, "Human, when you're done, report to the upper sector." Another system failed. The engineer didn't answer. Not because of anger, but because there was simply no energy left to speak. When the task finally finished, the engineer made their way to upper sector. The walk felt longer than normal. The station's walls seemed narrower, the lights brighter, the sounds sharper. Every step carried the weight of days without rest. When the engineer arrived, the supervisors were waiting with datapads in their hands. One pointed to a long list of problems. "You need to repair all of this today," the supervisor said. "And then you'll start the testing cycle tonight." The human blinked slowly. "Tonight?" "Yes," the supervisor replied. "You don't need sleep as often as we do. You can manage." The engineer tried to respond politely, but the voice came out thin. "I've already worked for 16 hours. "That's not unusual for your kind," the supervisor said, waving a hand. "The station depends on you. If you're tired, move faster." Other workers standing nearby felt their chests tighten. Even they knew this was too much. A few stepped forward as if to say something, but they stopped themselves. Challenging a supervisor usually ended badly. The engineer lowered their tools to the floor with a soft clink. Something in their posture changed. Nothing dramatic, no shouting or angry gestures. Just a slow, calm shift. The human stood still for a long moment, breathing in the recycled air of the station. Then they said something no one in that room ever forgot. You've pushed me too much." The words were calm, soft, almost gentle, but the effect was immediate. The room went silent. Some species knew the stories. They had seen old reports, heard rumors, and listened to veterans who once served with humans in dangerous missions. Those veterans had said the same thing. If a human, normally patient and quiet, says they've been pushed too much, step back. Immediately. It is not a threat. It is a warning that they have reached a line humans rarely cross. The supervisors, however, didn't know these stories. They laughed. They thought the human was being dramatic. "Stop complaining," one of them said. "You're perfectly capable. Get to work." But the engineer didn't pick up the tools again, not instead. The human turned and walked away. Not fast. Not with anger. Just a steady, firm walk toward the door. The supervisors ordered the human to return. They raised their voices. One even grabbed the engineer's arm. That was the moment everything changed. The human looked back over their shoulder, and though their face was calm, their eyes carried a weight none of them had seen before. Not rage, not hostility, just a final, tired resolve. "I won't be treated like this anymore," the engineer said. "If you want the station fixed, then start treating people fairly." The supervisor scoffed, but others in the room felt something shift inside them. The younger workers looked at the human with wide eyes. Some were scared, not of the human, but of what the supervisors had done to push someone so patient to the edge. One alien worker whispered to another. "They finally said it." The other replied, "We need to leave, now." The supervisor shouted again, but no one moved toward the human. A few even stepped aside, clearing the path. The engineer walked through the door, and for the first time in weeks, the human didn't feel like the station was pressing down on. Their shoulders word spread fast in the cafeterias, the corridors, the control rooms. Everyone repeated the same line. The human said they've been pushed too much. Some reacted with fear, remembering old tales of humans reaching their breaking point and achieving impossible things, sometimes brilliant, sometimes terrifying. Others felt sympathy. Some felt guilt. A rare few admired the courage. The engineer didn't make a scene. They simply sat alone in a small maintenance room, breathing slowly. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of machinery. The human knew something had to change, not just for themselves, but for others on the station, who were treated the same way. Back in the upper sector, the supervisors argued. They blamed everyone but themselves. They didn't understand why other workers were backing away nervously. They didn't understand the meaning behind the human's words. They didn't understand that they had pushed the wrong person too far. But the rest of the station understood perfectly. Every species who had worked with humans before shared the same belief. If a human says they've been pushed too much, it means they have reached the end of their patience. And when a human reaches the end of their patience, something is about to change, something big, something no one can ignore. This moment, simple and quiet, would soon spread across the galaxy as the beginning of a story every species would talk about for years. Not because the humans shouted or fought or caused chaos, but because humans rarely speak those words. And when they do, it means the world around them is about to shift. The engineer didn't know it yet, but their calm warning on that station would become the event that changed how the entire galaxy viewed humans. It started with a sentence spoken, so softly that only those nearby heard it clearly. But soon, everyone, every species, every station, every outpost would learn why those words were enough to make even the bravest creatures stop in their tracks. And it all started with one exhausted human whispering, "You've pushed me too much." After the incident on the research station, word traveled faster than anyone expected. It moved from worker to worker, from one department to the next, then to other stations, through quiet whispers and private messages. Everyone repeated the same sentence like it was some kind of warning from an old legend. The humans said they were pushed too much out at first. It sounded almost unbelievable. Humans were known for being patient, calm, and willing to help even in difficult situations. Most species admired them for their endurance. Some even depended on them for tasks no one else wanted to do. So when people heard that a human had reached their limit, the reaction wasn't laughter. It was concern. One group of engineers on a nearby station listened to the message in silence. After a long pause, one of them said, "If a human loses patience, that means things must have gone very wrong." Another replied, "I've never seen a human give up before. They always keep going." These were not dramatic reactions. They were honest observations from species who had worked beside humans. For years, they knew that humans rarely complained loudly. They also knew that when humans did speak up, it meant the problem had grown far bigger than anyone realized. Across several star systems, reports began appearing in internal logs. They described situations where humans had been pushed too far before, long before the research station incident. Some of these stories were buried inside old files. Some were forgotten by officials, but not by the workers who lived through them. One story came from a mining outpost where a human technician had been assigned double shifts for months. They accepted everything quietly. They helped fix broken drills and repaired machinery others refused to touch. But eventually, just like the engineer on the research station, that technician said the same sentence, "You've pushed me too much." The next day, the mining supervisors rewrote the entire shift schedule because the other workers refused to let the human be treated unfairly again. They weren't afraid of the human. They were afraid of what it meant when a human reached that point. It meant the balance had been broken. Another story came from a trade ship where a calm human diplomat worked with alien merchants who constantly raised their demands. Every time the human adjusted to meet them. Every time the human stayed polite. Until one day the diplomat, exhausted and frustrated, finally said the same sentence. The merchants froze, remembering old stories their elders told them. They lowered their demands immediately. These were not angry outbursts. They were quiet warnings. Warnings spoken only when humans felt they had no other choice left. Now, after the incident on the research station, these stories resurfaced all at once. People began connecting the dots. They realized the pattern wasn't random. It was something deeply human. Humans could endure stress longer than almost any species. They could take insults, pressure, long hours, and unfair treatment without responding aggressively. But when the pressure became too much, they didn't explode. They simply changed. Their tone changed. Their decisions changed. And the world around them changed with it. On the research station itself, the situation continued to develop. The supervisors still didn't understand what had happened. They saw the human's behavior as disobedience, not as a sign of burnout. They called meetings to discuss how to bring the engineer back to work. Their solutions were cold and unrealistic. One supervisor suggested disciplining the human. Another suggested replacing the human entirely, but the other workers refused to support these ideas. They knew the supervisors had crossed a line. One worker, who had kept quiet for months, finally spoke in a trembling voice. "You pushed them too hard. Anyone would break." The supervisors dismissed the comment. They believed the problem could be solved with strict orders. Their lack of understanding made the situation worse. Meanwhile, the engineer who had spoken, the famous sentence, spent the next hours walking through the quieter sections of the station. The air was cooler there, the lights dimmer. Every footstep echoed softly through the long hallways. The human wasn't angry. They were tired, deeply tired, in a way that sleep alone couldn't fix. They thought about how long they had ignored their own exhaustion. They thought about how many times they had said yes when they wanted to say no. They thought about how many people had relied on them simply because they never refused help. Humans often carried such thoughts. Silently. They didn't want to burden others. They didn't want to cause conflict. But silence had a cost. And this time, the cost had become too heavy to carry. In different corners of the galaxy, people continued talking about the incident. Some felt sympathy. Some felt fear. Some felt respect. And some remembered their own experiences working with humans. One alien navigator recalled a moment when a human crewmate had warned them gently during a dangerous mission. "I can handle pressure, but this is too much." The navigator had ignored the warning at the time. Later, the mission nearly ended in disaster because the human had been pushed beyond their limit. Since then, a navigator always listened carefully to human warnings. Another worker told a younger trainee, "When a human says they've had enough, you stop immediately. It means they've been enduring things silently for far longer than you think." These were not rules written in any official manual. They were lessons learned from real experiences, passed down like quiet wisdom. Back on the research station, the supervisors made a new mistake. They thought the human's reaction was a one-time problem. So they sent a message ordering the engineer to return to duty immediately. The message ended with a cold reminder: "You are needed. Do not waste time." The engineer read the message. In silence, they closed their eyes for a moment, then set the communicator aside. They did not respond. When the supervisors noticed the silence, they grew frustrated. They sent more messages, louder and more demanding. Still no response. Other workers noticed the human's refusal before the supervisors did. And instead of fear, many felt admiration. One worker whispered, "They finally stood up for themselves. Good." But admiration was only part of the reaction. Another emotion spread across the station: uneasiness. Not because anyone believed the human would harm someone. Humans rarely acted violently. The uneasiness came from something deeper: the realization that a human who normally carried the station's burdens had finally put those burdens down. Some employees began avoiding the supervisors. Others refused to take on new tasks until the treatment of workers improved. A quiet resistance began to grow. And although the engineer did not lead it, their simple sentence had sparked it. A few workers finally gathered the courage to visit the human in the maintenance room where they had taken a break. They didn't come with orders. They came with concern. One of them asked, "Are you all right?" The human nodded slowly. "Just tired." Another worker said, "We never said anything, but we saw how much they were giving you. It wasn't fair." The human looked surprised. "Why didn't anyone say anything?" The worker sighed. "We were afraid. But when you spoke up, it showed us we should have said something sooner." The human appreciated the honesty. They didn't hold any anger toward the workers. They understood how difficult it was to challenge authority. While this small conversation happened, messages about the human who finally reached their limit spread to other stations like a wave. Each time the story was told, it became a little clearer, a little more detailed, and a little more symbolic. Across the galaxy, a pattern formed. Humans were calm, patient, and hardworking. But they had a breaking point. And when they reached it, everything around them shifted, not through force, but through a sudden clarity that made others examine their own actions. Soon, stations far away began discussing whether they had been treating their human workers fairly. Some supervisors reduced workloads. Some teams added rest cycles. Some learned for the first time that humans needed emotional support, not just physical rest. The research station, however, still struggled to accept this truth. The supervisors believed the situation could be controlled. They believed they still had power over the human and everyone else. They failed to realize that the humans' quiet refusal had already changed the atmosphere of the entire station. Reactions continued to spread. Some workers avoided the upper sector completely. Others moved their tools to different areas. Some even transferred departments. No one wanted to be part of the environment that had pushed a human to that point. And yet, in the center of all this movement, the human remained calm. They didn't shout. They didn't demand revenge. They simply refused to return to the unfair. Conditions. It was this quiet strength that left the deepest impact. Eventually, even species who had never met a human began discussing the event. They asked questions like, how much pressure does it take to push a human that far? And what happens when their patience ends? The answers varied, but all followed the same idea. Humans rarely reach that point. But when they do, the world around them must adjust. The research station had not yet adjusted, but soon it would have no choice. The simple sentence that started with one exhausted human was now turning into a lesson. The entire galaxy could feel growing in the distance. And this was only the beginning. After the incident on the research station, stories of humans reaching their limits began appearing from every corner of the galaxy. Some of these stories were centuries old, buried in dusty files, while others were recent events that had not yet been reported widely. Slowly, species began noticing a pattern: humans endure pressure far longer than anyone else. And yet, when they finally say they've had enough, the consequences are always striking. One such story came from a remote colony on a planet with harsh storms and unstable terrain. The human engineers there were assigned impossible tasks: repairing shelters, maintaining power systems, and keeping communication lines open during constant electrical storms. For months, the humans worked tirelessly, while the alien supervisors criticized every little mistake, expecting perfection under extreme conditions. The humans never complained. They woke before dawn, worked through relentless storms, and slept little. Each time a shelter collapsed or a power line failed, they repaired it quietly. Every alien on the planet believed humans were naturally limitless, capable of handling anything without protest. But there came a day when one human finally stood in the middle of the collapsed energy hub, tools in hand, and looked at the supervisors. Calmly. Their voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that silenced everyone around them. "You've pushed me too much," the human said. The aliens froze. They had seen humans work endlessly, but they had never heard this tone before. There was no anger in the voice, no yelling, no threats. Only a quiet, firm declaration that this human's endurance had reached its limit. The supervisors were unsure how to react. They were used to humans absorbing pressure endlessly. They expected obedience, not resistance. Within hours, the human had reorganized the entire colony. Tasks were redistributed, shifts shortened, and even the alien supervisors were forced to adjust their expectations. No violence occurred. No threats were made. The simple act of stating limits had caused a ripple effect, forcing everyone to rethink how they treated the humans. Another example came from a diplomatic mission, where humans had been negotiating with multiple alien civilizations. These negotiations were intense, with every species trying to gain the upper hand. Humans were respected for their patience and calm reasoning. They were known for listening carefully, responding politely, and handling complex problems that other species could not manage. Over time, the alien diplomats grew impatient, mistaking human patience for weakness. They increased the demands, pushed deadlines, and used subtle threats to pressure the human negotiators. For weeks, the humans accepted the strain, working late into the night, responding to endless requests, and finding compromises that no one else could. One day, after reviewing a particularly unreasonable set of demands, one human leaned back in their chair and said in a quiet but steady voice, You've pushed me too much." The room fell silent. Alien diplomats stared at each other. Some whispered, unsure of what this meant. Others froze completely. There had been rumors, yes, of humans reaching their breaking point, but many of these species had never experienced it firsthand. The calm tone was unsettling. It did not threaten them with immediate violence, yet the effect was undeniable. Within hours, the negotiations shifted. The humans took control not by force, but through clarity and authority that came from reaching their limit. Aliens who had been aggressive suddenly became cooperative. They realized that the humans' patience was not endless, and that when a human finally spoke, they were willing to act decisively and intelligently, solving problems in ways no one expected. Across colonies, stations, and fleets, similar incidents were being reported. Humans rarely broke under pressure, but when they did, their words became powerful signals that changes were necessary. It wasn't just about speaking up. It was about demonstrating that quiet endurance has a boundary. And when that boundary is reached, humans can respond in ways that command respect. Scientists studying human behavior began to take notice. They collected data from multiple incidents: humans in engineering roles, humans in military or defensive roles, humans in diplomatic positions, and even humans in remote research posts. The pattern was clear. Humans have a tolerance for stress, far beyond what other species can handle. They rarely complain. They rarely resist. They rarely make mistakes under pressure, but the moment they do resist, the impact is immediate. Systems are reorganized. Policies are adjusted. Even species with no direct interaction with humans begin to hear the stories and understand the significance. Historians dug through archives and found evidence from Earth history that supported these observations. There were countless examples of humans enduring extreme conditions, from natural disasters to societal pressures, and always finding ways to overcome them. When humans finally said enough, they didn't cause destruction. For its own sake, they caused transformation. They found solutions. They changed circumstances. And in doing so, they taught others a lesson that was impossible to ignore. One historian described a human working on a collapsed space bridge connecting two stations. The alien overseers demanded immediate reconstruction under dangerous conditions. The human had already worked for 3 days straight, repairing structural beams and rerouting energy lines. When asked to begin the final segment without rest, the human paused, straightened, and said, softly, "You've pushed me too much." No one had anticipated this calm declaration. The overseers expected compliance or complaint, but not the quiet authority that followed. The human then spent the next few hours coordinating the reconstruction with smarter, safer methods, organizing workers efficiently, and completing the project in record time without anyone getting hurt. The calmness, the clarity, and the firm decision-making were exactly what made the human stand out. Through these stories, species across the galaxy began to understand a truth they had underestimated for too long. Patience is not weakness. Endurance is not submission. And humans, when they reach their limit, have a way of changing situations without anger, without force, but with undeniable authority. On the research station where the original incident occurred, this understanding began to take root. The supervisors, who had once dismissed the engineer's statement, slowly realized that other humans on the station were watching, learning, and adjusting their own behavior. Workers started speaking up more often, setting boundaries for themselves. The environment became more collaborative. The engineers who had silently endured months of unfair treatment finally felt empowered to communicate their limits. Even species unfamiliar with humans began noticing the pattern. Communications across star systems referenced incidents like the research station, the mining colony, and the diplomatic mission. Reports emphasized the same sentence: "You've pushed me too much." The phrase became recognized as a warning signal, a quiet yet firm declaration that something needed to change. It wasn't about fear of humans. Humans rarely acted violently. It was about the recognition that humans are capable of enduring extreme stress quietly, and that when they finally say enough, they do so with clarity and effectiveness that demands respect. Other species began to acknowledge that when a human reaches their limit, it is wiser to adjust behavior, to provide support, and to reconsider expectations. The human-centric aspect of these stories became the focus. Humans were not portrayed as aggressive or vengeful. They were portrayed as individuals who quietly carried burdens, often at great personal cost, and who, when pushed too far, responded in ways that solved problems and inspired others. For many species, it was a revelation. They had assumed that patience meant passivity. They had assumed that silence meant submission. They had been wrong. Humans had patience, endurance, and a remarkable ability to persevere. But humans also had limits, and when those limits were reached, their actions were transformative. The research station engineer became a symbol of this truth. Workers shared stories of how one quiet declaration had sparked change. Newcomers were told to observe humans carefully, to understand that patience is a form of strength, and that the moment a human says they've been pushed too much is the moment real attention and respect are required. Across fleets, stations, and colonies, humans continued their work. They repaired systems, negotiated with aliens, and carried heavy responsibilities. They still endured long hours and constant pressure. But the galaxy now understood that this endurance came with a boundary, and that boundary was powerful. In some ways, the stories were inspiring. Other species learned lessons about fairness, empathy, and the importance of listening. Humans taught them, not through threats or violence, but simply by reaching a point where they could no longer accept unreasonable treatment. That moment became a turning point for many civilizations, and yet there was still much to learn. Many supervisors and leaders had yet to experience it firsthand. They still underestimated humans. They still assumed compliance was endless. But the stories were spreading, growing in clarity, and shaping perceptions across the galaxy. By the end of this chapter of events, the pattern was undeniable. Humans endure quietly, work tirelessly, and solve impossible problems. But when they finally speak up, when they finally declare they've been pushed too much, it is no longer a simple statement. It is a signal that change is required. It is among. The story of humans reaching their limits was no longer just a rumor. It had become a lesson that spread across fleets, colonies, and stations throughout the galaxy. Reports arrived from distant worlds, each telling the same theme in different ways. Humans endure quietly, work tirelessly, and yet, when they finally declare they've been pushed too much, everything changes. On one particular diplomatic mission, humans were working with a coalition of alien species known for being strict and often aggressive. The humans were tasked with mediating trade disputes, settling arguments over territory, and managing resources that were scarce across several planets. Normally, humans excelled in these situations because of their patience, their ability to listen, and their clear thinking under pressure. The alien negotiators had noticed this and had begun testing the humans, deliberately adding pressure and unreasonable demands to see how far they could be pushed. For weeks, the humans accepted the strain without complaint, answering every request, staying late into the night, and finding solutions that others could not. The aliens began to assume that human patience was infinite, that they could be pushed endlessly without consequence. Then one day, during the final phase of negotiation, one human looked around the crowded meeting room and said clearly, "You've pushed me too much." The effect was immediate. The alien delegates froze, unsure how to react. They had been accustomed to humans adjusting, compromising, and staying calm. This time, the words were not just words. They were a signal that the human had reached a point where normal patience had ended, and something different was about to begin. The humans didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They simply made it clear that the current situation could not continue. And with that calm but firm declaration, they began to propose solutions that no one had expected. They reorganized the negotiation process, set clear limits on demands, and introduced rules that protected fairness for all parties. The aliens, though initially stunned, had no choice but to follow. They realized that ignoring the human statement would create confusion and disorder, while listening would lead to a more organized and productive negotiation. In the end, what began as a tense confrontation ended in an agreement that benefited everyone, including the humans who had finally spoken up. Meanwhile, news of the humans' calm authority traveled fast across other colonies, fleets, and stations. Species who had only heard rumors now paid closer attention. They began to understand a new rule of interaction with humans. Patience has limits. Quiet endurance is not endless. When humans say enough, it is not a threat. It is a turning point. Back on a distant research station, another incident unfolded that reinforced this lesson. A group of humans had been assigned to repair a critical communication network that connected several colonies. The aliens overseeing the project assumed humans could handle extreme workloads without complaint. They demanded the work be completed within impossible timelines, and when mistakes occurred, they blamed the humans harshly. For days, the humans complied, working longer and longer hours, coordinating repairs and fixing errors caused by others. But one day, after reviewing a particularly complex section of the network, one human stood and said, "You've pushed me too much." The other workers immediately understood the significance. They had seen humans pushed before, but this calm, clear statement meant something deeper. The human had reached the end of their patience. The words were not spoken with anger or frustration. They were spoken with quiet authority, signaling that the current situation needed urgent change. The alien supervisors hesitated. They had been used to humans silently accepting pressure. Now, they faced the reality that their assumptions were wrong. They were forced to adjust timelines, delegate responsibilities more fairly, and allow humans to work under conditions that were safe and reasonable. Without a single threat or act of violence, the situation improved drastically. Stories like this began to reach even the most distant fleets. Some species that had never directly interacted with humans started training their workers on human behavior. They emphasized patience, endurance, and the importance of respecting limits. Manuals included notes about listening carefully when humans say they've been pushed too much, understanding that it is a signal for change, not confrontation. On another front, humans in exploration missions faced similar challenges. They often worked in remote environments, with unpredictable conditions and dangerous tasks. Aliens in charge of the missions frequently underestimated the physical and mental toll. Humans adapted, adjusted, and kept moving forward quietly. But when they finally spoke, it was clear that the balance had shifted. One human, after weeks of repairing and maintaining life support systems in a storm-ravaged region, stopped and told the alien supervisors, "You've pushed me too much." Supervisors were stunned. They had expected compliance. They had assumed humans would simply keep going. Instead, they were met with calm, firm authority. The human didn't abandon the work. They reorganized it. They assigned tasks efficiently, showed the safest and most effective methods, and completed the mission with minimal risk. The human had turned exhaustion into leadership, not chaos. Meanwhile, back on the original research station, the first human who had spoken the words, "You've pushed me too much," had become a quiet legend. Other humans followed the example by respectfully setting boundaries, and the culture of the station began to shift. Workers became more vocal, about their limits. Supervisors learned, slowly but surely, that expecting endless endurance was unwise. Even species that had never encountered humans began to notice the stories. They shared warnings in their fleets and stations, advising younger crews, if a human says they've been pushed too much, listen carefully. Do not assume weakness. This is a warning that demands respect and immediate adjustment. The phrase became more than just words. It became a symbol of human resilience, endurance, and authority. It represented a turning point in relationships, projects, and negotiations wherever humans were involved. The calm, measured statement was more powerful than aggression because it forced others to reconsider their actions and expectations. Over time, humans continued to work tirelessly. They repaired starships, negotiated disputes, explored new worlds, and maintained critical systems. They endured long hours and constant pressure. But the galaxy had learned to watch carefully, to recognize when patience had reached its limit. And when humans finally spoke, the results were transformative, not violent. One fleet commander noted in their log, "Humans endure more than any species we have observed. Their patience seems infinite, but when they finally declare enough, it is not a moment of anger. It is a moment of clarity that forces everyone to reconsider their actions and priorities." The galaxy slowly began to understand that patience is a form of power. Endurance is not submission. And humans, when pushed to their limits, respond with intelligence, efficiency, and authority that reshapes the environment around them. Even in the farthest colonies, workers and supervisors discussed the implications. They realized that respecting human limits was not just ethical, it was practical. Ignoring the signs could result in inefficiency, mistakes, and lost opportunities. Listening and adjusting, on the other hand, led to solutions, cooperation, and unexpected innovations. Humans had become a quiet force across the galaxy. Not through violence, not through intimidation, but through endurance, patience, and the simple but powerful ability to set boundaries when necessary. In this way, the galaxy began to respect the phrase, "You've pushed me too much." It was no longer just a statement. It was a signal. It was a turning point. It was a reminder that humans are patient, resilient, and capable of extraordinary endurance, but even they have limits. The story spread from station to station, fleet to fleet, planet to planet. It inspired new policies, new behaviors, and a growing awareness that respecting humans' limits was essential for harmony, efficiency, and success. And the humans, as always, continued their work. They continued to endure, to repair, to negotiate, and to lead. But the galaxy now understood that when a human finally spoke, it was a signal that could not be ignored, and that calm, quiet authority could transform the outcome of any situation. The lesson was clear. Patience has boundaries, and humans, when pushed too far, turn their endurance into a quiet, unstoppable force that reshapes the world around them. And with that, the galaxy had begun to change. After decades of stories spreading across the galaxy, the phrase, "You've pushed me too much," had become more than just words. It had become a warning, a lesson, and a symbol of human strength. Every species that had interacted with humans began to understand it in the same way. Humans endure quietly, they work tirelessly, and when they finally say enough, the world around them changes in a way that cannot be ignored. On one distant colony, a team of humans had been tasked with constructing a series of energy collectors in a harsh desert region. The environment was unforgiving. Sandstorms arrived without warning. Temperatures reached extremes, and alien supervisors constantly changed requirements, demanding new adjustments and faster progress. For weeks, the humans worked without pause, repairing machinery, stabilizing structures, and adjusting plans as the weather and terrain shifted. The other species on the colony were amazed at their patience. Every time a new problem arose, the humans calmly assessed it and solved it. Every time a mistake occurred, they adapted quickly and efficiently. Even the youngest humans, barely experienced in such conditions, learned to work with precision. Under pressure, their endurance seemed endless. But as always, patience has a limit. One day, after weeks of non-stop labor under impossible conditions, a human engineer paused in the middle of a collapsed collector. Tools in hand, dust covering their uniform, they looked at the alien supervisors and said softly, "You've pushed me too much." The effect was immediate. The supervisors, who had believed humans would always comply, froze. They had never heard the phrase spoken so calmly and firmly. The other workers, both human and alien, watched in silence. There was no shouting, no anger, no threats. Just a simple statement that signaled the end of endurance. What followed was remarkable. The human did not walk away or abandon the work. Instead, they began reorganizing the entire construction plan. They delegated tasks more efficiently, introduced safer methods, and made adjustments that allowed the project to continue without anyone being overworked or at risk. The energy collectors were completed faster and more effectively than the supervisors had ever imagined. And everyone involved understood that it had been the human's patience and quiet authority that made it possible. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the story of the research station, the mining colony, the diplomatic mission, and now the Desert Energy Project had become part of a growing legend. Every species, every fleet, every station had heard about humans reaching their limit. It was no longer a rare occurrence. It was a recognized truth. Humans endure like no other species, but when they finally speak, their words carry power that transforms situations. In educational centers across star systems, teachers began sharing these stories with young recruits and new workers. They explained the importance of respecting human limits, of listening carefully when a human says they've been pushed too much. It was a lesson in patience, endurance, and understanding. It was also a lesson in humility. Even those species who had never met a human directly began to take notice. Across distant fleets, commanders instructed their crews. If a human says they've been pushed too much, treat it as a signal. Do not assume weakness. Adjust your approach. Respect their limits. It is better to listen than to ignore. These instructions were not just about efficiency. They were about safety, cooperation, and understanding the unique qualities humans brought to the galaxy. On the research station where the first incident had occurred, the culture had shifted completely. Supervisors who once demanded endless labor learned to respect limits. Workloads were reorganized, schedules became fairer, and humans were allowed time to rest, recover, and contribute their best work without being pushed to exhaustion. Workers began speaking up more often, empowered by the example of one human who had dared to declare the truth calmly and clearly. One human, after completing a critical maintenance cycle, quietly walked through the station corridors. Other species watched, not in fear, but in respect. They had seen humans endure more than any other species, adapt under impossible pressure, and yet maintain calm and clarity. They had also seen what happened when humans finally said enough. It was not chaos. It was transformation. It was leadership, born from endurance. The stories of humans reaching their limit also began influencing decision-making across fleets. Commanders who once relied solely on strict orders started observing their human crews more closely. They began to see the importance of balance. Pushing too hard could backfire, but allowing humans to work within fair limits created extraordinary results. They learned that patience is a hidden form of power, and that humans channel their strength best when they feel respected and understood. In one fleet, a human engineer faced a critical failure on a warship's energy core. Alien officers demanded an immediate repair under conditions that were dangerous and unreasonable. The human worked quietly for hours, analyzing the problem, coordinating with the crew, and planning solutions. When the officers pushed too far, demanding instant action without caution, the engineer finally spoke. "You've pushed me too much." The officers paused, startled. For the first time, they realized that their assumptions about human endurance were flawed. They adjusted their expectations, allowed time for careful repair, and followed the human's guidance. The energy core was stabilized without incident, and the ship returned to full operation. The calm authority of the human engineer had prevented disaster. As these stories multiplied, species across the galaxy began to understand a key lesson. Humans are patient, adaptable, and enduring, but their endurance is not limitless. Respecting their limits is not optional, it is necessary. Ignoring the signs of human exhaustion or pushing them too far leads not to chaos or rebellion, but to quiet, firm intervention that changes the outcome in ways that others may not expect. Even in remote exploration missions, the pattern was clear. Humans navigating uncharted planets, repairing alien technology, and managing crises in unpredictable environments were known to tolerate extreme conditions. But when they finally spoke up, their calm words carried authority and inspired action. Their patience had become a form of leadership, and their limits had become a measure of influence across multiple species. Historians began documenting these incidents, creating a detailed record of human behavior under stress. They noted the pattern. Humans rarely complain, rarely act rashly, and rarely display anger. But when they finally declare enough, it is not weakness that follows. It is clarity, efficiency, and undeniable authority. Humans have the rare ability to turn endurance into leadership, exhaustion into wisdom, and limits into lessons for everyone around them. Even species with long histories of conflict and competition began to respect the human approach. They shared stories in private conversations, in training sessions, and in strategic discussions. The phrase, "You've pushed me too much," became a recognized warning, a signal that humans had reached their limit and that the situation required immediate attention and adjustment. On another planet, a human medical team faced a crisis in a quarantine zone during a disease outbreak. Alien administrators demanded rapid action without adequate equipment or support. The humans worked tirelessly, improvising treatments, stabilizing patients, and managing logistics under extreme pressure. When the administrators pushed them further, insisting on impossible timelines, one human quietly said, "You've pushed me too much." Immediately, the administrators understood. They adjusted policies, redistributed resources, and allowed the human team to work safely and effectively. Lives were saved. The outcome was far better than anyone could have expected, all because one human had spoken calmly and firmly, marking the boundary of endurance and inspiring proper action. Through these examples, the galaxy learned an important truth. Humans are not reckless, aggressive, or destructive when pushed. They are patient, enduring, and intelligent. But when they finally declare that they have been pushed too much, it is a signal of authority, clarity, and leadership that cannot be ignored. On every station, colony, and fleet, the lesson became part of training, culture, and practice. New recruits were taught to respect human limits. Supervisors were instructed to observe carefully, listen actively, and adjust expectations when necessary. The galaxy had learned that humans are not only resilient, but also transformative when their endurance reaches its peak. And yet, humans continued their work as always. They repaired starships, built colonies, negotiated treaties, and explored unknown planets. They endured long hours, unpredictable challenges, and constant pressure. But they did so with the knowledge that their patience is respected, that their limits are understood, and that when they finally speak, Their words carry the weight of clarity and the power to reshape their surroundings. The phrase, "You've pushed me too much," became legendary. It was not a threat. It was not an attack. It was a signal that humans, while patient and enduring, had a boundary. When that boundary was reached, change occurred not through anger or chaos, but through quiet authority, problem solving, and the natural leadership that comes from perseverance. Generations of humans continued to demonstrate this principle. Across fleets and stations, across colonies and missions, they worked tirelessly. They endured more than any species had expected. And when the time came, they